Welcome to our interview with Stefan Engel. It's good to have you here, Stefan. You are the head of the editorial team Revolutionary Way and author of the book The Crisis of Bourgeois Natural Science. How does this volume fit into the book series The Crisis of Bourgeois Ideology and the Doctrine of the Mode of Thinking? The natural sciences are generally considered to be neutral, free of ideology, and are also readily used as witnesses to certain political decisions or certain interpretations. However, this notion is a bit naive. There are no neutral or ideology-free natural sciences. The development of the natural sciences, especially in the 19th century, was very progressive. It was a factor of the Enlightenment and, at the same time, in turn gave the Enlightenment a material basis. If you look at the history of the natural sciences, they play an important role in the ideological struggle and have themselves always been a product of ideological discussion. In the 19th century, the modern natural sciences developed in physics, chemistry, astronomy, and biology. With the emergence of imperialism, however, some new methods also developed that have a very negative impact on the scientific content of the modern natural sciences. These are mainly pragmatism, which is only based on what is useful in the sense of capitalist profiteering, or positivism, which more and more replaces practical analysis with mathematical calculations. And these two methods are very problematic because they also allow many pseudoscientific interpretations. You can see that very clearly in astronomy and the kind of nonsense being spouted there. With every new discovery, a new story is dished up about what is actually taking place in the universe. That already begins with the Big Bang, or for example, these theories of the black holes, where there is supposedly no matter and no laws. These are all very fantastical things that go more in the direction of a pseudoscience and therefore in turn contribute to further confusion in society. The book does not claim to be a science book, but it does deal with a number of science topics. How did you decide on the selection? Well, we first dealt with the real modern natural sciences, physics, astronomy, biology, in order to show how the crisis of bourgeois ideology also has negative repercussions for the development of the natural sciences. To be a science, it is not enough to have an accumulation of knowledge. Science, rather, is an integral, logical way of approaching things. Otherwise, we can't speak of science. Today we have many fields, for example, medicine. There's a great deal of knowledge, many insights, individual bits of knowledge about diseases and their effects and so on. But there's no integral science, and you get treated accordingly. If you have heart problems, then they deal only with the heart, and if you have trouble with your foot, then they treat only your foot. But there's no holistic view of human beings, and there's simply no holistic therapy against these diseases. In addition, all the interactions with society, with the existence of people in their families, all of this is ignored. This is no way to work scientifically. No one asks where all this comes from, how everything is connected. So in medicine, you have to get a hold of very good doctors who think for themselves, who also examine correlations and also approach things dialectically and not simply according to the guidelines that they learn today in their studies or in hospitals. Of course, this has given rise to a lot of conflicts in medicine, to criticism of medicine, which, due to its whole orientation toward maximum profit, naturally has also become a bubbling source for international monopolies in general. This criticism is justified, but it must be deepened and must be continued down to the ideological roots. And that is what we try to do in this chapter on bourgeois medicine. Is then alternative medicine the right answer to the justified criticism of conventional medicine? There are two large categories that must be distinguished. On the one hand, there is natural medicine, which is based in part on experiences from 3,000 years before our time in China, in the Andes, etc., which has generated many interesting methods and remedies that are still valid today. For example, acupuncture. At the same time, however, an idealistic interpretation is put on many of these natural remedies. A lot is read into them. The explanation, the usual explanation for acupuncture is nonsense, of course. It's a real tall story if you take a closer look at it. But that's not really the question at all. There is still no sufficient scientific explanation for acupuncture. All we know is that it helps. At the same time, it conveys a lot of reactionary, idealistic ideas to people. And the worst of all, with homeopathy. Homeopathy originated from a parish priest who claimed that the less amount of medicine, the better the effect. And he said if there's no medicine left at all, then the effect passes over into the spirit. It dissolves into the spirit. That's a quite fantastical story. This couldn't be more unmaterialistic. And that is why this esotericism, homeopathy, are idealistic and partly also reactionary doctrines, which mostly start from the separation of mind and body and do not advance humanity. Of course, it is important that we also preserve every practical, positive experience and include it in our knowledge. But we also have to get to a point of comprehending it scientifically. And I believe that alternative medicine has a big problem in that it is not able to properly evaluate this scientifically because no scientifically based medicine exists yet. So you have to deal with things in a very differentiated way. So the answer is no, alternative medicine is not a comprehensive answer to the crisis of bourgeois medicine. By now, it's generally accepted that we are in an environmental crisis. But what exactly do you now criticize about bourgeois environmental research and its results? Well, it doesn't take much to realize that we are in an environmental crisis. But if you take a closer look at the prevailing bourgeois opinion, you will see that the environmental crisis, for example, is very much reduced to the so-called climate crisis. It's also downplayed with the term climate change. But we are not simply dealing with a climate crisis or even a climate catastrophe. We are dealing with a very widespread general destruction of the foundations of human existence. And in their so-called fight against the climate crisis, there are now also lucrative methods that generate billions in profit, such as wind turbines and the solar industry. they reap profits, and that is why they are sponsored the way they are. When it comes to the extinction of species, on the other hand, it would be necessary to enforce the renunciation of various harmful measures, which in turn would reduce profits. And that is why very little attention is focused on this. That has to do, of course, with the ideological basis of this research. We call this bourgeois or imperialist environmentalism, which puts forward the thesis that capitalist economy and ecology can form a unity. First of all, we think this is no longer fundamentally possible. We know very well that today a monopolistic mode of production also requires exploiting the natural resources to the maximum. They have to react because otherwise they no longer will be accepted by society. But they don't do this comprehensively. They do it selectively and play down the problems. And this environmental research is oriented the same way. We looked at the UN's 2022 environmental report, which clearly shows, for example, that in regard to the climate issue, we are now in a situation where certain tipping points have occurred that are not directly caused by humans, but indirectly by the global environmental crisis. I would mention, for example, the thawing of the permafrost or the melting of the ice caps at the poles. I also mentioned the upsetting of the balance of the Amazon jungle, which had always been a carbon sink since the dawn of humankind. It absorbed CO2. Meanwhile, it emits more CO2 than it absorbs, the oceans, etc. You can't reassemble glaciers. You can't recover the poles with ice again. You can't close up these permafrost soils. But they produce a destruction of the biosphere of such extent that today we can no longer simply speak of an environmental crisis. Rather, we are now talking about the beginning of a global environmental catastrophe. It has not yet spread all over the planet, but there are a whole number of irreversible points that are basically driving this environmental crisis. Even if humanity were to stop all fossil fuel combustion immediately, and various measures were taken, there are things in progress that already are going to cost the lives of hundreds of millions of people. So more and more people will be driven out of their homelands because they can no longer live there, because they either burn or drown, or because the sea floods more and more land. We will see catastrophes that we have never dreamed of before. And that is the condition that we have, for which these environmental criminals, these international monopolies and their governments are completely responsible. And this environmental research is nothing else than the accomplice to these environmental crimes. We must be very critical and clear on this point, that this is no good. In addition, the method of these environmental researchers is that they have some empirical knowledge that they store in their computers and then make some algorithms. For example, the thesis that up until 1.5 degrees Celsius, none of this is a problem yet, that only above it becomes problematic. But we are at 1.2 degrees now, and we already have these new qualities of environmental crisis. So how does this fit together? Instead of questioning their 1.5 degrees and finally reacting, they ignore it. All these factors are contained in this UN environmental report. No one draws the right conclusions from them, and I think that's a crime against humanity. At the same time, one simply has to have a scientifically sound view of the development of the biosphere with the unity of humans and nature in order to draw the right conclusions. Otherwise, this will also lead to panic. There is no point in young people gluing themselves to the streets now. How is that supposed to change the environmental crisis? We need a different society, of course, where these international monopolies are deprived of their domination, and we can build a society without exploitation and oppression, where humanity really can live in unity with nature. There is no other way to solve the problem, and even there, we are also in a race against time. Another development is that modern psychology has become enormously important over the last 50 years. How do you address this issue in the book? Today, it is assumed that about 1/3 of the population either was at some point or is mentally ill, or is in treatment. On the other hand, today psychology is no longer used only for medical purposes. So we have psychologists providing various kinds of care for people right up to production, where there are psychologists who influence the workers so that the production results are maximized and so on.
Maximiert werden und so weiter. Also die Psychologie ist schon sehr
So psychology has already become very important and also has many more branches. What we criticize above all is that the separation of mind and body still is the starting point of psychology. This is an artificial separation. There is no separation of mind and body. The brain is just as much part of the body, and that is a unity where the mind is the highest form of matter. The brain, however, is necessary in order to control and coordinate the functions of the whole body. And this separation of mind and body, although it has been relativized in modern psychology, has not yet been abolished, continues to exist. For example, a major factor in the increase of mental health problems today is the environmental crisis. The one-sided search for mental illnesses in the head itself is an expression of an idealistic approach, of course. It has also been recognized that stress, for example, leads to illness, and then people are told to retreat, to contain themselves, to stay at home and rest. But that's not right either, because the psyche is just an organ, a human function, how people find their way in society and their environment. And you can't solve the problem simply by getting away from it. Instead, you have to learn, above all, to fix this disturbed relationship. So we have made some suggestions here, but it is, of course, a discussion. But also correct is, of course, the fundamental criticism. This is the starting point of this idealistic separation of mind and body. You also examine bourgeois engineering. What does that have to do with ideology, people might say? What is your assessment in this regard? Yes, it is a fact that all major projects of recent, whether it be the Berlin airport or Stuttgart 21, are all projects that have nothing more to do with planning, that had to be constantly changed, turned out many times more expensive than planned, and partly cannot even keep what was promised. Of course, such a large project consists of an unbelievable complexity of individual projects. So they have specialists sitting in front of their computers who then feed everything in. But in such a context, it has not yet existed at all. And so problems come up that have not yet been part of the planning process. However, they also ignore concerns of the population. And with Stuttgart 21, things will not only be a few times more expensive than planned, but it even has to be expected that the final result now will be worse than the performance of the previous station. It's a disaster. With 20 years construction time and traffic chaos and what have you. And what is the reason for that? What is the reason? It has something to do with the method. Bourgeois engineering is not a separate branch of science, but is based on scientific knowledge. It has its roots in physics, chemistry, geology, etc., and then implements them. But it has adopted a method, a positivist and above all pragmatic method, so that the results are as quick and lucrative as possible. And this method is failing more and more. That is the subject of the book and has something to do with ideology. Pragmatism is a certain form of bourgeois ideology, just like positivism. And that is why it is also important to show by means of such examples how inept these bourgeois methods of bourgeois ideology are. Why should the working class movement also concern itself with natural science, in your opinion? It is not a coincidence that all the classics of Marxism-Leninism have pursued studies in natural science in order to better understand the dialectics that they then applied to political economy or social science or strategy and tactics. Scientific study trains the working class movement for a materialist view, a real view of things. But it also has the result that at the same time subjectivism, which is very strong among the workers and the population, or religiosity or superstition, are losing more and more ground. The more people understand how to approach things materialistically, the less room there is for superstition, for religion, and any other garbage. That is why this is so important. Scientific socialism also developed along the lines of the natural sciences. It said that we need a science also in social science, a science of socialism. The dream of a classless society, of a communist society, has existed for a very long time in humanity. It was not invented by the Marxist-Leninists, by the way. It can be found in Islam, it is written in the Bible, it can be found in all world religions that they imagine such a society. Only they have very idealistic conceptions, of course, a divine order like paradise, or as it is, however it's described. What Marx and Engels did was nothing else than to develop a science following the natural sciences, so socialism became a science. Thus, scientific socialism is by nature very closely connected with the bourgeois natural sciences, and dealing with the natural sciences helps the working class movement to see more clearly, to work more scientifically, and thus to become more successful. Considering all the criticism of bourgeois natural science, how can a progressive and modern natural science develop now? It's not easy because, of course, this is also a societal question. It is not conceivable that the natural sciences as a whole will develop into a progressive science within the framework of the capitalist order, let alone the imperialist social order. And why? Because here the bourgeois ideology prevails with all its metaphysics, with its very profane ideas of reality. We must be very clear about the fact that modern natural science today only brings us closer to reality if it is dialectical materialistic, if it uses the method that is also predominant in nature. Nature is dialectically organized. Matter is dialectically organized. Everything is dialectically organized, and this can only be understood if dialectical materialism is applied. That is, if the method is applied which also prevails in nature. However, a dialectical materialist mode of thinking is present only in a minority, of course, and one has the impression that the modern natural scientists today do not think dialectically at all. We need a social order in which the leading ideology and the leading method in science is inspired by dialectical materialism. That means, in the end, this question too cannot be solved in any other way than by an international socialist revolution, by putting the whole exploitational society into the dustbin of history, and really letting the workers, the toiling masses, determine social being, and then they will also have an interest in reality. So in the end, the only way out, also for natural science, is to join the socialist revolution. We tell this also to the scientists, the progressive natural scientists with whom we cooperate. We cooperate with scientists in many forums like this, but many of them still don't think much of dialectical materialism. They have certain single criticisms, but they have to find a way to dialectical materialism, to the dialectical materialist method. This will be important not only for the workers, it will also be important to win scientists for the path to socialism. And it will also help our comrades, also our intellectual comrades, who often deal with their profession somewhat uncritically. So the book will help to exercise a certain well-founded criticism here, and perhaps then also to become a better doctor, a better psychologist, and a better scientist. Well, it all sounds very demanding. Is this a book for workers at all? Yes, definitely. We recommend that people approach the book and they should perhaps read the introduction and the first chapter, and then they should approach a chapter to which they have more access, because they perhaps have more experience with medicine or with psychology, or experience from production with engineering. You can take it up that way, but it's also very important to get help. We have study groups, we have discussion groups where you can discuss these things. When writing this book, we took extra care to avoid unnecessary complicated connections that are not really required for understanding the book. We assume that people can understand the book even without a high school diploma or university studies. Of course, you have to occupy yourself a bit. You also have to be interested. It's not all that easy. We have also offered help, for example, with study groups, through events and discussions, or also through correspondence that you can then have with the editors. So it's not an insurmountable obstacle. It will be beneficial to everyone who reads the book. I am firmly convinced of that. Anyone who reads the book, I'm firmly convinced, will enjoy a very mobilizing progress of knowledge if they study the book. Thank you very much, Stefan Engel, for the exciting interview, which has certainly raised interest in the book. We are very curious about it. And if you now want to order the book for yourself, you can do so at Mediengruppe Neuer Weg, the link to which you will find in the video description.
Ja, sicher, dann sag das so einfach.